Namaste and good evening. I, Chavi Jain, researcher at IMPRI, Impact and Policy Research Institute, Prabhav एवं नीति अनुसंधान संस्थान, Nai Delhi, extend my warmest welcome to you all to IMPRI #Web Policy Talk. Today, we have gathered here for a distinguished lecture on climate change and the future of water security in South Asia. This discussion is a part of the series, The State of the Environment, #Planet Talks, organized by IMPRI, Center for Environment, Climate Change, and Sustainable Development. I would now like to introduce our speaker for today, Professor Scott Moore. Professor Scott Moore is a political scientist whose work focuses on water politics and policy, especially in China and South Asia. Sir is currently a senior fellow at the Penn Water Center, as well as director of China Programs and Strategic Initiatives in the Office of the Provost at the University of Pennsylvania. Until 2018, Sir was a young professional and water resources management specialist with the World Bank Water Global Practice, where he co-led a study of China's water sector with the Development Research Center of the State Council and was a co-author of 2 flagship reports, High and Dry, Climate Change, Water and the Economy, and Uncharted Waters, The New Economics of Water Scarcity and Variability. Previously, Sir served as Environment, Science, Technology, and Health Officer for China at the US Department of State, where he worked extensively on the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. And prior to that, Sir was Giorgio Ruffalo, Postdoctoral Research Fellow at the Harvard University. Sir has also published widely on the full range of global water issues in leading publications, including Nature, Foreign Affairs, and the New York Times. Sir is also the author of Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building in Shared River Basins, published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. We are honored to have you with us, sir.
Thanks very much. I'm likewise honored to be part of this incredibly important series, and I think it is a really important moment to be discussing environment and especially climate change issues. First of all, just as we kind of have been transitioning from the release of the latest report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the main international scientific body that produces regular assessments of climate change. And as we look forward to the major upcoming UN climate conference in Glasgow, Scotland in December. So I'm going to go ahead and...
Professor Moore, if you could just give us a moment to
Sure.
Introduce our discussants, and then we could...
Oh, I'm sorry.
No worries.
Sorry, skip
No
the gun
worries.
there, but yes,
No
please.
worries.
Go
Yes.
ahead.
Javi, over to you. No problem.
Our discussants for today are Dr. Ranjana Ray Chaudhuri and Dr. Indira Khurana. Dr. Ranjana Ray Chaudhuri is a faculty in the Department of Regional Water Studies, TERI School of Advanced Studies, New Delhi. And Dr. Indira Khurana is the Vice Chair at Tarun Sangh, Alwar, and Director at Coastal Salinity Prevention Cell. We are honored to have you both with us, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to IMPRI. We are looking forward to hearing Professor Moore.
Same here, looking forward. And thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
Our moderator for today is Dr. Simi Mehta, CEO and Editorial Director at IMPRI. I would now invite Dr. Simi ma'am to proceed with the delegation. Thank you, ma'am, and over to you.
Thank you, Chavi, and thank you to everyone for joining us this evening and this morning from the United States. So yes, as Professor Moore already began by telling about the sense of climate change emergency and the code red that has been highlighted by the IPCC first report of the sixth assessment report. So it actually says that there is a lot that is happening in South Asia, which is a subcontinent in itself. And adding to the woes is the climate change emergency, which is negatively impacting the inhabitants in varied proportions. And one among the numerous implications is water, is on water. So both excesses and also in shortages. So the result of this has been a lot of uncertainty, which is simply very, very magnanimous, I would say, and incomprehensible to the common mind. So to make sense of the phenomenon and on the future of water security in the subcontinent, we have with us Professor Scott Moore, joining us early this morning from the United States. And we are so fortunate that we are joined by two eminent scholars who are also grassroots workers and water experts, Dr. Khurana and Dr. Chaudhuri. So we are fortunate to be hosting this very, very important lecture and discussion. And please accept my gratitude and warm welcome. I would not take any further time and invite Professor Moore to begin with his lecture. Professor Moore, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mehta. And I do just want to add that I'm very pleased to be joined by Dr. Chaudhuri and by Dr. Khurana to draw on their expertise as well. So hopefully you can now see my screen.
Yes, please go. Yes, please go ahead, sir.
Excellent. Yeah, no matter how many times I do this, it always seems like a minor miracle when screen share actually works. But it is a pleasure to be with you all. And I did just want to say, kind of by way of introduction, that as was mentioned, I'm a political scientist and originally a China specialist. But over the last few years, I've become increasingly interested in South Asia for a couple of reasons. I think if you are, as I am, are interested in the politics of water, both in terms of how water affects politics and political economy within countries, as well as international relations, South Asia is probably the single most important and interesting area of the world from both of those perspectives. Given that so many transboundary rivers in the area relate to a number of significant geopolitical powers, China, India, Pakistan, etc., as well as how significant water issues are in domestic politics in India, in Pakistan, in China, and other countries in the region. I think it's a very rich case study and globally important in terms of the implications of water, not just domestically, but also regionally and internationally. So I want to try to touch briefly on all of those dimensions, hopefully spend the first 2/3 of the talk or so talking about recent changes that we've seen in terms of South Asia's water resources, what we can expect going into the future as climate change accelerates, but also to talk a little bit about how that might affect both international relations in the region, as well as a little bit domestic political economy as well. And you'll forgive me if I move fairly quickly because I want to give time for our discussants and for some discussion as well. Just to kind of take a step back and look at the big picture, this map presents about 12 years of observations from a satellite called GRACE. And what GRACE enables us to do is basically look at how the world's water resources are shifting at large regional and even global scales. And there are basically three things that you can see in terms of what's happening to the world's water resources overall. You see the melting of the polar ice caps, and to some degree in the world's high mountain regions as well. You see some precipitation shifts around the world, especially in the mid-latitude regions. Some of that is linked to natural variation, some of it to climate effects, most probably. And then the third thing that you see is groundwater depletion. And I want to say a couple of words about that. because if you look at South Asia in particular, you can see this massive kind of cone of groundwater depletion that's centered on northwestern India as well as parts of Pakistan. And that's significant for a couple of reasons. First of all, that really signifies very inefficient and unsustainable water management. Basically, what you're seeing here is the taking out of very large quantities of water from the ground at rates that are far in excess of the rate at which that water is naturally replenished. So essentially, you're overdrawing the groundwater account, so to speak. The other thing to note is that this has a significant linkage to climate change because groundwater is really what you turn to in times of drought or water shortage. So if you're taking, if you have sort of unsustainable rates of groundwater depletion, what you're doing is depriving yourself of this kind of crucial reserve that exists, particularly for irrigated agriculture in times of drought or water shortage. So this is all to say that if we sort of take a global perspective of what's happening to water, we do see these significant climate-related shifts, but we also see really inefficient and unsustainable patterns of water management that then make the sort of climate change effects of water that much more significant and concerning. And it does bear emphasis that what we've seen from the latest IPCC report released just a few weeks ago continues to be a pretty concerning set of predictions with respect to future warming. This graph is from the IPCC report, or this graphic rather, shows a couple of projections for different rates and levels of warming above pre-industrial levels. The two things that I want to focus your attention on are the two panels in the middle. Those are the ones with green coloring, and that depicts precipitation. The panel on the left, so sort of closest to the left-hand side of the slide, looks at essentially summer precipitation, and the panel next to it on the right projects or depicts winter precipitation. And you can see essentially shifts in the predicted intensity of the monsoon. And basically what you see is we can expect significantly decreased precipitation during the summer months and increased precipitation during the winter months. In some cases, very significantly. And if you look at the bottom of the graphic, that 4 degrees of warming scenario, you see really strong intensity, changes in intensity of that expected precipitation. And that actually gets to one point I want to emphasize, particularly when it comes to South Asia and water and climate change. Typically, the concern centers on water shortage, drought, and scarcity. And yet, probably having too much water and in the case of flooding is as significant a risk and a hazard and a challenge for water management in the region. Perhaps goes without saying, but also important to emphasize, one of the main climate effects that we're concerned about in the South Asia region is melting of glaciers and snowpacks in the high Himalaya and throughout the Himalayan plateau. This is a region that is commonly referred to as the third pole because of its high elevation and high rates of warming. And one of the things that's sort of counterintuitive about climate effects in the South Asia region is that rates of warming actually tend to be higher in the high elevation regions. You can see that over toward the right-hand side of the slide. There's a graph there of temperature against elevation. And essentially, and unsurprisingly, what you see here is pretty rapid and significant melting, particularly of glaciers. The bars that you see in the center portion of the graph there, the red bars show loss of glacier mass. The blue bars show gain, and as you can see, the loss dramatically outweighs any gain, and the majority of glaciers in the high Himalaya have suffered a loss of mass over the last couple of decades. Also worth noting, in the sort of top right portion of the graph there, you can see that the rates of glacial mass loss in the Himalaya have been pretty much in the middle, globally speaking. So the highest rates of ice mass loss have been seen in areas like the Andes, while the lowest have been seen in places like the Arctic. So the Himalaya region sort of sits roughly in the middle globally in terms of what this looks like. But this is probably the single most significant climate effect that we're seeing here is a pretty dramatic loss in terms of glacial mass and to some degree snowpack mass loss as well. The major implication of this for South Asia hydrology is that it's increasing the volume of flow in a lot of the major rivers temporarily. And it bears emphasis that this is not a kind of sustainable phenomenon in the sense that once the glaciers melt, once the snowpack shrinks as a result of warming, it's not going to come back. So we are seeing a significant increase in the volume of flow in major rivers as we see that melting, but that is going to eventually taper off probably toward the end of the century. The timeline, of course, depends a little bit on the rates of warming that we actually experience. But what you see here in this graph is just the degree to which glacial and snowpack meltwater contributes to the flow of the major rivers. You can see the Indus, the Ganges, the Brahmaputra, Salween, et cetera, portrayed there. And it does depend river to river. The Indus depends more so than the other major rivers on glacial melt, but it's a significant contributor to virtually all of these major rivers, in addition, of course, to snowpack melt. One thing that, and this, of course, has a lot of effects, but one that I think is worth spending a couple of minutes on is the phenomenon of GLOFs, glacial lake outburst floods. And this underscores what I mentioned earlier, that one of the sort of paradoxes of climate-related water impacts in South Asia is that having too much water in the form of flooding can be just as hazardous and challenging as having too little. And GLOFs essentially are floods that are caused by glacial meltwater. These lakes are created when you have either ice from a glacier or a terminal moraine, which often sits at the bottom of glaciers, or some other geologic feature that causes the meltwater from a glacier to be impounded. And then through a variety of circumstances, whether it's an earthquake or melting of ice dams or other things, that dam fails, that natural dam fails, and you get significant floods. And there have been a number of recent such GLOFs experienced, and that's a hazard that will continue to increase as we see glacial melt increase and as we see the size of those lakes increase. And this graph here just depicts roughly the distribution of risk that we can expect from GLOFs. As you can see, it's centered primarily in the central and eastern portions of the Himalaya. One thing that I do want to touch briefly on is the role of uncertainty. While the overall effects in terms of warming and in terms of an increased volume of flow in the major Asian rivers in the medium term, followed by a significant decrease in the long term, that's all very close to certain. But there are significant uncertainties at the kind of more local level. The kind of more fine scaled you get, the greater the uncertainty is. This is a map of different, the projected future precipitation change as a result of climate on several portions of the Indus Basin. And the left and right-hand portions of the graph depict the results of different climate models that are used to predict those precipitation changes. And you can see that the model projections are very different in terms of the degree of perceived change. So just to underscore that we do have some significant uncertainty when it comes to local and sort of sub-basin scale impacts in terms of water resources. In the big picture, though, we're certainly going to see increased variability. And that's one thing I want to underscore. It's not just the fact that we can expect the volume of flow in major rivers to decrease significantly over the long term, for example. Probably the more important impact is that the availability of water in major river basins, in aquifers, is going to become a lot more uncertain. in terms of parts of the year. And here you see projected water availability essentially, or flow, across different months of the year for different subbasins in the Indus macro kind of river basin. And you can see the dark blue line is baseline. So in virtually all subbasins, you see really significant shifts in what we can expect for water availability at different points throughout the year. This is a major challenge, not just for policymakers, for water managers, but very much so for water users, especially farmers who have grown accustomed to some degree of annual predictability and interannual predictability of flow. So this is a really significant challenge going forward. Just to kind of briefly highlight too, as significant as the impact will be for agriculture, and of course in South Asia, as is the case globally, irrigated agriculture is the dominant water use. But these changes, and especially the variability, is going to have a major impact on cities as well. And I wanted to just briefly highlight the case of Chennai as one among many examples of this. 2015, Chennai experienced pretty significant flooding that was very unusual in terms of the time of year it occurred, or at least the time of year combined with the volume of flooding that it experienced. Just a couple of years later, Chennai experienced a very significant water shortage event. And it has to be said that this event was not solely due to climate change. There were lots of other factors at play, but the takeaway was that the city's water reserves were depleted essentially to nothing. The photo there depicts the major reservoir that supplies the Chennai metro region. And it came sort of very close to water supplies being disrupted to the majority of urban residents. Lots of people had to depend on tanker truck water deliveries as opposed to municipal water supplies. And that really underscores the degree of potential disruption of these climate-related water shifts in the future for South Asia's urban areas, as well as its rural and agricultural areas. One point I just want to highlight very briefly, although I'm obviously focusing on climate change water-related water effects here, also bears emphasis that there are other things going on that exacerbate the impact of climate-related water shifts. One of them is pollution. The commonly cited statistic is that about 80% of India's surface water resources are contaminated. That, frankly, is probably low. This is just any one of many photos that I could have displayed. It's toxic foam on some waterways outside of Bangalore. And the net effect of this, I mean, obviously there's a really significant and concerning environmental health dimension of this, but effectively this contamination is also reducing the quantity of water resources that's available in total. So when you think about disruption to water resources, both in terms of the time of year that we can expect it, as well as periods of drought or water shortage, the fact that there's so much contamination of the water resources that do exist effectively reduces the supply of available water even further. So these issues, although they have different causes in terms of climate change versus environmental pollution, do have a kind of combined effect that's very negative in terms of water resources. I want to now shift briefly to just talking about some of the implications of these changes. And one of the things that you often hear is a sort of linkage between the idea of increasing pressure on water resources, especially forms of water scarcity, and increased prospect of violent conflict, especially warfare. And I just, sort of put up here two relatively well-known statements of that predicted linkage between water challenges and especially scarcity and shortage and the likelihood of conflict. And as you can see, particularly at the bottom, this has been a hypothesis or a prediction that's been especially influential when it comes to South Asia. Certainly there are lots of good examples that you can point to of major international tensions over water, especially between India and China. And one thing that's definitely worth highlighting here is the inclusion in China's latest 5-year plan, the 14th 5-year plan, of what seems to be a large-scale development of hydropower in the upper Brahmaputra especially centered on what's known as the Great Bend of the Brahmaputra. This is a particular part of the world that has one of the highest hydropower potential in the world, always has. And the predictions are that constructing a series of hydro plants in this region could potentially generate about 60 gigawatts of hydropower. That would make it by far the world's largest hydro dam, about 3 times the size of China's Three Gorges, which is the largest existing hydropower dam in terms of installed capacity. Has generated a lot of concern, understandably enough, in India and in South Asia more generally, Bangladesh, in terms of its potential implications if built. And yet, there's also a lot of misconception when it comes to thinking about these the potential linkage between whether it's development of a hydro dam or increasing water scarcity in the basin, and what that might actually mean for international relations and cooperation over shared water resources. Something that I think is important to emphasize in the case of the Brahmaputra is that the majority of precipitation, it's actually about 93% of precipitation in the Brahmaputra basin actually comes from Indian territory, which in turn means that the vast majority of the flow, particularly in the lower Brahmaputra, actually does originate from within Indian territory, meaning that large upstream dam construction, while it would have a lot of disruptive effects on the river's hydrology, actually wouldn't affect the overall volume of flow in the basin all that much, and that diversions associated with that construction would actually have a somewhat limited impact. And this graph just shows the spatial distribution of precipitation in the basin. Again, you can see that the majority is concentrated within Indian territory, which is the sort of lower half of the basin map that you see there in that chart. At the same time, it's somewhat ironic that although there's a lot of attention placed on the prospect for conflict over water in South Asia, in fact, South Asia plays host to one of the more successful international water agreements in the world, the Indus Water Treaty. There's certainly a lot to say about this that we can get into in discussion, but 2 things I want to say about it. One, while far from a perfect agreement, it has survived 3 full-scale wars, as well as several kind of lesser conflicts between India and Pakistan. The members of the Permanent Indus Commission, the body that represents India and Pakistan and sort of effectively administers the treaty, has continued to meet, most recently in March 2021, despite the pandemic. And this has really been almost unique in terms of India-Pakistan relations, that it has been relatively unaffected by conflict and by tension between the 2 countries over the last almost 80 years since the treaty was concluded. That being said, particularly within India, it's become increasingly controversial of late, and that actually gets to one thing that I want to talk a little bit more about, which is how water issues have become very politicized, especially within India, to some degree within Pakistan as well, and have become a real focal point for political conflict. I want to say just one last thing, again, in sort of the vein of a bit of a counter to this idea of water challenges leading to conflict. It's worth underscoring the potential for international and regional benefit sharing from hydropower development. China certainly has, this is a table that shows the distribution of estimated hydropower potential percentage-wise in the Himalayan region. And as you can see, China has kind of the majority, but India and Bhutan and Nepal isn't depicted, but Nepal as well have significant portions of hydropower capacity and potential as well. And there's a lot of potential for power sharing agreements and joint infrastructure development that could benefit multiple countries instead of just one. We can certainly come back to that. Just briefly want to highlight that throughout India's recent political history, really certainly ever since independence, but even going much further back, the central government in particular has continually confronted challenges with respect to water management, and especially relating to conflicts and disputes between Indian states. And that's something that continues to be an issue. I'll touch briefly on that, back on that in a second. But suffice it to say that water management issues have kind of continually tested the governance framework that exists in the Indian Union and India's federal system, as well as Indian politics more generally. One particular way of looking at that that I think is significant is in terms of the increasing weaponization and politicization of water issues. And this is something that I think really makes the case of India stand out, to some degree Pakistan as well, globally. And as part of my the book that was mentioned at the outset, I actually looked at a number of case studies of these sort of water conflicts that occur within countries around the world. And one thing that stands out in terms of South Asia and India in particular is the degree to which water issues have been sort of taken up by particularly regional political parties as major wedge issues, things that are used to mobilize supporters and to vilify opposition parties. And you have one sort of aspect of this that's particularly interested me is how water issues have come to define politics in Telangana since it became a state in 2014 and separated from AP, Andhra Pradesh. And this is sort of an interesting case because you can sort of see how a newly independent state and the political leaders that lead it effectively took water issues as a major way of essentially establishing a separate identity from their former parent state and creating this sort of conflictual relationship. And there are just a few quotes there that I think sort of illustrate the progression of this politicization just in the first few years after Telangana became a state. You see statements like from the Telangana CM saying things like that the AP government has taken a vow to destroy farmers in Telangana. You get this very charged, politicized, weaponized language around water that contributes to a lot of tension and conflict, and in turn really prevents effective water management throughout India. Just to kind of also emphasize that it's not a phenomenon that just takes place in India. You see some similar dynamics in Pakistan, although there the interstate disputes are less significant than the degree to which failures of kind of water supply and availability have become a significant cause of discontent just from citizens, and particularly the middle class, urban middle class, dissatisfaction both with local political leaders as well as to some extent the national government. So the point I want to draw from all of these kind of cases is that these climate-related water challenges combined with issues like pollution are really stressing politics and political systems, particularly within India, but elsewhere in South Asia. And in some ways, that is kind of a more concerning development than the stresses that climate-related water issues have placed on the international dimension. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Look forward to some comments from discussants and then some broader discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moore. That was an excellent presentation and so many points you have raised, very, very pertinent. So I would now invite Dr. Indira to share her remarks. And ma'am, what do you think? There are several questions that have been raised, very important. So could you please elaborate? Over to you, ma'am. Ma'am, please unmute.
Yeah, first of all, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And I don't know how to thank you, Dr. Moore. You have given such a comprehensive view, perspective, replete with data about the situation of water resources in South Asia, and also looked specifically at India. You've also looked at the politics. So really thank you for that. There are so many thoughts, actually. I don't know where to start and where to end. I think one of the challenges I feel, and it came at a very timely Personally, for me, Professor Moore, this talk by you came at a very timely. It was really timely because just in the beginning of this month, we've started the Indian Himalayan River Basins Council, which is looking at so the Himalayan states as well as the states in the plains where the Himalayan rivers flow or other rivers get into the Himalayan rivers. So this is covering about 23 states. And it was precisely for the challenges that you mentioned that we felt that there was a need to do this for the Himalayan region. And we also have a similar council formed for the peninsular rivers. The main objective of this is to create awareness about the situation of water and how people can connect to rivers and water, given the challenges that you have stated. And on top of all those challenges that we now have the challenges of climate change and how it's going to alter the, the water cycle and the availability and excess and shortage of water availability. So that's why I wanted to connect this with this kind of effort that we are doing. I think if you just coming to the points around climate change, I think what reducing emissions is to mitigation, I think water is to adaptation. So we really need to see how we can manage our water given the situation that we are faced in, and even what you mentioned about Chennai and other states in India. In fact, I write popular articles on water and all these climate change, etc. But I've stopped giving data as to, okay, Calcutta was flooded, Patna was flooded, so Chennai was flooded, Delhi was flooded, because every day there is another city. Right now, I think Calcutta is in the throes of the complete city is waterlogged. They shut off the sluice gates for the Hooghly because, otherwise the Hooghly River water will come in. So historically, we have been mismanaging our water. And now we have this issue about climate change. And I think what the last couple of months really showed us that earlier it used to be something that would happen in the underdeveloped or developing nations. But now this kind of crisis is all over the world. It's you name an African country, you name Middle East, you name South Asia, the Americas, it's there, Europe, it's there everywhere. And I think there's so many aspects to this. I mean, okay, first you would look at humanitarian aid. I'll just cite one aspect. Okay, we will get humanitarian aid from USA or from Europe. But right now, they themselves are going to be struggling through the kind of challenges because of climate change. So that is going to shrink the kind of resources that are available. And we also we need to reflect that, are we happy, content with just going from one disaster to another disaster to another disaster? Is that the way that we want to live all the time, trying to, to manage the disasters and not really look at the aspirations of countries? So I think it calls for serious thinking within the country, within the region, and we must have science that informs our policy. I think the challenge is that scientists sometimes pick up courage to say, you can't do this, you shouldn't do this because it's going to affect your hydrological regime. But still, the politicians go ahead and make decisions which are contrary to good water management. So I think that's why I feel the work about raising water awareness and getting more people's voices into informing government and policy is important. Also, you mentioned about groundwater. I mean, it's ironical that I think you showed North India is where we have a really hard, severe extraction of groundwater, and yet that is the Ganga, the Ganga River Basin. So you have so much of water, but still in that area, you're doing so much of groundwater extraction. So it shows, again, it shows how poorly we have been managing our water resources. And whereas groundwater should be a reserve bank, it should be the Reserve Bank of India. That's the groundwater resource. But that's something that we are just sucking out without putting water back inside. So I think we really need to look hard at how we can right now manage our water, because we may focus a lot and we need to focus on reducing our emissions. So that's one part. But the crisis is on us right now. So what can we do? And this is what I want to ask you also at a decentralized small people scale. What is it that we can do to at least minimize the impact of the disasters, if not get, kind of do away with the disasters, because now it's, I think, a chain reaction that has started. But how do we minimize the effects on ourselves? And you mentioned variability and uncertainty. So I wrote an article saying that when weather scientists do crystal ball gazing, because that's what they said, that the extreme weather event in Europe, the extreme heat wave in Canada, that they could not foresee that it would be such an extreme and for so long. So they're asking for better computers, supercomputers. Is that really the solution? The solution lies in better management of water. And the last point I'd say is that we share rivers, but we also share groundwater aquifers with our neighboring countries. So that itself is something else that we need to look at. And unfortunately, the system has become very aggressive. We don't believe in soft diplomacy anymore. We don't believe in civil society discussions, negotiations, understanding each other's perspective, be it across country borders or be it within states or between the rural and urban divide in India. So I think those options we really need to look forward to more. And I'd really like to ask you, okay, now what do we do? What do people like us, who are concerned, who want to do something, and there are many more, there are thousands more, there are 100,000 more. What is it that we can do to kind of reduce the stress that we are facing ourselves? So thank you for now.
Thank you, ma'am, for raising very important points. So I would now invite Dr. Ranjana to share your comments.
So thank you very much, Simi and Professor Moore. Yes, South Asia is it's a very thickly populated region. So very timely your talk, and thanks to IMPRI as well, and Indira Madam too, the points that you raised. So I would like to say a few things. First of all, we at TERI School of Advanced Studies, it is a Department of Regional Water Studies. So that Regional Water Studies was set up with a vision to look at the water challenges in the region as a region. The other is we have done a little bit of work in the city of Gurgaon, and as we know, Gurgaon is adjacent to Delhi. It is in the National Capital Region, but this groundwater depletion that you are talking about in northwestern India, it is very rampant in Gurgaon. Gurgaon is a city where it is heavily dependent on groundwater, and the levels have gone down quite fast. So the green corridor of the Aravallis, which used to be used for recharging the groundwater there, whatever groundwater recharge was possible, that is being depleted heavily. So, and because of the real estate prices there and encroaching of that area, so it's really worrisome. So we really need a policy. So we look forward to hearing from you, what kind of a policy should we have so that the groundwater recharge is imperative? Why is it that the awareness levels are not at where it should be regarding the groundwater recharge? What is the way forward? How do we go about it? The other is, you mentioned about Telangana and use of Krishna River waters. If we go further down to the delta region of Bay of Bengal, we see that River Krishna no longer has any water. In fact, they have that basin closure problem, where the utilization of water has been so much to the canal system that in the delta, the farmers are forced to use groundwater again. And that has led to ingress of saline water from the Bay of Bengal to the delta region of Krishna River. So they are facing twin challenges of River Krishna not having too much water in the delta region, and the second is that there is an ingress of seawater, and so the groundwater is also becoming saline. So very challenging for the farmers there. And the other issue about water security and climate change that I would want you and Madam Indira to also reflect on, and perhaps we could have a small discussion on the fact that we are talking in terms of increasing sugarcane production for the fact that we want to go for biofuel, ethanol production, and we are also thinking thinking of going for palm oil production, palm oil being cheaper. And again, in the northeastern region where there is a lot of rainfall. But both palm oil as well as sugarcane are real water guzzlers. They need a lot of water. So when there is going to be climate change and we are entering this period of uncertainty, how wise are we in our decision to be, actually going for increasing sugarcane production and palm oil production? So can we suggest a way forward for that? So those are my immediate thoughts. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you, ma'am. So I would request Professor Moore to respond to the remarks that have been made by our panelists. Professor Moore.
Thank you again, Dr. Mehta. And I want to thank Dr. Khurana and Dr. Chaudhuri for a very provocative series of comments. And I think the major point, which they both quite rightly raise as well. Okay, great. We understand the extent of the problem. What can and what should we do about it? So I'll try to offer a couple of thoughts on that. With some humility. I mean, if I think any one person had all the answers, we would have probably done these things a long time ago, and certainly would have if they were easy. So very few of them are easy. But I want to start at the level of kind of individual responsibility. What can individuals do about these problems? Because it's that is obviously critically important in terms of thinking about our own levels of responsibility for these very large global challenges. And I think there are a couple of really important, at least three important things that you can do as an individual person to lower your impact on the world's kind of water stresses and individual contributions to the world's water crisis. The first, which is admittedly something that South Asia scores much better on than most of the rest of the world, is to eat less meat. Just globally speaking, kind of most forms of livestock raising have an outsized water footprint as compared to consumption of fruits and vegetables. Legumes are especially kind of water efficient. So again, South Asia, kind of from a culinary perspective, already doing much better than most other regions of the world. But that's sort of part one. Part two, try to drink as little bottled water as possible. Now, granted, that's a challenge where water quality is is an issue, or where municipal water services may not be very reliable. But as a general matter, that is something that deprives municipal water services of important revenue, and the kind of footprint associated with just transporting bottled water is very harmful. Often it's drawn from already stressed groundwater reserves, and then you have the fuel and the energy that's needed to transport that bottled water to where you consume it. And one of the things that's kind of interesting about water and important to keep in mind from a climate change perspective is that water has a very high, it's very heavy and therefore expensive and energy intensive to transport per unit volume. So you do have very significant energy demands associated with the transport of water, whether it's piped water or crates of bottled water. The third thing is just to recycle products as much as you can. When you buy a new shirt, this is an old shirt, by the way, the water footprint embedded in growing the cotton that's used to make that shirt, for example, is very significant. So to the extent to which, particularly things like fabrics, things that have a high water footprint can be recycled, that's obviously going to facilitate conservation of water as well. But at the same time, these are very large-scale global challenges, and so even as it's important to kind of think about individual responsibility, there's no denying that we need policy action by national governments and by the world at large to tackle all of these challenges. And so I'll kind of get to now more to that. And I think some of the most important policy changes that governments can make. This actually includes, in the case of India in particular, this is primarily state level responsibility, to some degree municipal, rather than central or national government. But thinking about land management is really significant. I believe, and I apologize if I get this attribution wrong, I believe it was Dr. Chaudhuri who brought up changes in sort of land use as a contributor to groundwater withdrawal, and things like forest cover and having trees that help to retain water in the soil, that can really significantly affect things like groundwater storage and again, the availability of groundwater in times of drought. So having policies that preserve forest land, that protect surface water resources, that create buffers between urban built up areas and major rivers. They can reduce pollution, they can help increase water storage. Those types of policies can be really significant in terms of how land use shapes water use and water management. Another really important thing is water pricing. One thing about water that you have to say, it is a critical resource. So there are really important equity considerations at play, and you don't want to have a sort of unrestricted, sort of free-for-all market pricing of water. But nonetheless, increasing the price of water, particularly for agricultural users, can be effective in encouraging conservation. So I think that's an important policy tool that has to be figured into the mix. Again, politically, usually not popular, but it is an important policy kind of instrument to remember and take account of. The last thing I would point out, which kind of gets to the value of this discussion hosted by IMPRI, is NGO involvement. One of the problems with water from a political perspective and a policy perspective is that it does tend to get very kind of controversial on one hand, and on the other hand, to be sort of channeled through very specialized, highly technical bodies like engineering departments or irrigation departments, things like that aren't necessarily equipped to think about all of the many complex implications of how you manage and allocate and use water. And I think a really important role that NGOs can play is to try to help kind of bring together lots of interests when it comes to the use of water. And again, one thing that's distinctive about water as a resource is that it's absolutely critical to every community, every population, every economic sector. So to some degree, you do have to bring many different interests and stakeholders and perspectives together to have effective and efficient water management. The last thing, which I'll just touch on briefly, but one of the most effective kind of water management policies globally would be some effective climate mitigation strategies, and that gets back to, I think, the importance of anticipating the climate conference that'll take place in Glasgow in December. And I may just say a quick word about that. I've been involved in, I was involved in the Paris Agreement discussions. I had a brief period of service in the US government. And this is obviously an extremely complex issue, but one thing I think we have to both acknowledge and at the same time get beyond is the idea that every major economy doesn't have to fundamentally transform itself as a result of climate concerns. This is particularly significant in the case of India, because India's per capita emissions are a fraction of those of the US or even China and most other large economies. So there's a very understandable and strong political current in India saying that to the effect that, well, the majority of this problem has been caused by other countries. India remains, very much in a developmental stage. So, while it will take on significant commitments, it's not going to, agree to significantly reduce its emissions, particularly over the medium term. And that while understandable, that will lead us to catastrophe. because of the sheer size of India's economy and its contribution, not just to current emissions, but also to future projected emissions. So where I think that takes us is we do need a lot more focus on joint financing of clean technology. So for example, carbon capture technology that might allow India to keep burning some coal, but without releasing the related emissions into the atmosphere, as well as financing to help marginal and vulnerable populations in India and elsewhere adapt. So I do think this has to be, something where the developed world kind of puts its money where its mouth is, so to speak. And yet at the same time, I do think it's critical for constituencies within India to help us move beyond this sort of developed versus developing countries divide. It may not be exactly fair, it may not be exactly just, but where we are in our climate crisis is such that we just have to cut emissions and cut them very, very quickly if we're to avoid catastrophe.
Great, thank you, sir. Indira ma'am, would you like to respond to Dr. Ranjana's query, and if you want to add anything what ma'am has just spoken, please unmute, ma'am.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yes, definitely we need the issue about proper groundwater policies that has been around for the longest. The challenges have been around for the longest time. So we really need to see how we move forward on that. And my perspective is that India, with its, with some of the traditional practices and decentralized approaches, if we really get serious on that, and even the government of India, the Water Ministry, Jal Shakti, has started campaigns for replenishing groundwater. So if we take that seriously and coupled with some of the things which Professor Moore said about reducing water footprint and recycling and reusing, I think that's something that we could do. The challenge, what she mentioned about palm cultivation, I mean, that's a big challenge because you're also going to cut forests which are, virgin forests, and you're going to do this palm plantations. And what's that going to do to the ecology, and what is that going to do to the water, how the water flows? Because that does affect the flow of water. Professor has already told us that you need to have, trees which can retain moisture, and so, your soils are moist. So I think that's going to be a challenge. And the other thing that we do now is we have compensatory afforestation in another place that's allowed now. So if you're cutting forests in Andaman and Nicobar, you can do the compensatory afforestation in Madhya Pradesh. I mean, so what happens to Andaman and Nicobar? So I think that's what I said, that we need our science to actually inform our policy, and we need more people to understand and get into this. And this is what even Professor said, that maybe civil society and organizations like IMPRI can play a role in this. Yes, I think we need to increase financing for adaptation, because I think a very small amount of the climate finance goes into adaptation. To me, I feel India has some experience of addressing a drought. I shudder to think what to do, what he mentioned about excess rainfall, that, you're going to have so much more of rainfall. Our flooding is, the newspaper has stopped reporting it. Bihar has gone through like 6 or 7 waves of floods. And earlier, all of them, 20 years ago also, the people would say, and even now, the water comes and it goes and it deposits silt. So we have good agriculture, but now the water comes and it doesn't go. So, what do we do with this, quote unquote, living with floods? So I think that's something we will really need to think about.
Thank you, ma'am. And taking from there, when you talk about now the water is there to stay, especially in several parts of Bihar. So this also means that there is a direct correlation between the rising temperatures and the water stresses, and on which the food and nutrition security actually depends. And on this, on this food and nutrition security depends is the health of the people, and especially the women and children. And last year's global hunger index shows the deplorable situation that India and of course all of South Asia, with a few countries as exception, that they are in. And so my question actually to Professor Moore is more about, people are talking about climate resilient and sustainable agriculture. And then this actually then would mean that then we would be influencing the consumer choices, because the production patterns would be like changing. It would vary because as you know, we in South Asia at least, we are dependent upon the staples, rice and wheat. And so in the next 20 years, it is being said that you need to cut down on the production of these staples, because these are they take a lot of water in the production stage. So, and then you spoke about meat production, which is definitely true. So we are definitely going to influence the production and the consumption choices. And in fact, on these is dependent is the food distribution, the public distribution system, to the as welfare schemes to the poor and vulnerable sections of the society. So where are we then headed towards? Because of course the prices are then going to increase. So the buying capacity, etc., will definitely be challenging. And you spoke about the intercountry hydropower sharing and the agreements. So do you think that it can be done on an equitable grounding? Because Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, India, especially the sub-regional framework, there are challenges between, of course, they are moving towards some sort of an agreement, cooperation agreement, bilaterally and as a framework as well. But the geography, the terrain, and several other things like politics, it comes into picture. So then where are we headed towards? Of course, it is not one answer that can be shared, but if you could share your thoughts. And of course, then there are two questions from the audience as well, which we can take after this. Over to you, sir.
Sure. Thanks very much, Dr. Mehta. And two excellent questions. I think for the kind of first part of the question anyway, there is a commonly used phrase, which I'm sure is familiar to many folks here, the food, energy, water nexus, which kind of gets at the idea that there is a relationship and really a set of trade-offs between how kind of, well, I think what it really comes down to is priorities. Whether you're prioritizing maximum agricultural yield for kind of hunger reduction or for economic, kind of agrarian development, the way in which hydropower, is a significant source of energy in places like China, to a lesser degree, India, and then how water, feeds again back into agriculture, into hydro. So that's an important kind of concept to keep in mind, that there's this sort of relationship between water, energy, food, many other things as well, ecology, health, and changes in policy or use in any one of those things affect all of the other sectors. Ultimately, it does kind of come back to priorities. I guess I would suggest that I think the dominant consideration really should be carbon footprints. So if we're kind of thinking about moving to a more sustainable climate policy, both in India and globally, something I think we'll have to think more about are things like what's called climate smart agriculture. And these are kind of farming practices that actually aim to maximize the amount of soil that can be sequestered, the amount of carbon that can be sequestered in the soil. There are ways that you can farm that sort of maximize this. That is not the way that you maximize crop yield. So there is right there, you've got a sort of inherent conflict between having a policy that maybe maximizes food security or nutrition, and one that maximizes climate benefit. So there are going to be these tough trade-offs, but I would point out that from a global perspective, there really shouldn't be an issue with feeding the world if we can sort of maintain essentially free trade in food. If we can maintain trade systems that allow the kind of fairly open exchange of food commodity, agricultural commodities, there really shouldn't be an issue with feeding the world. You know, I mean, some obviously subtleties there. You'll have to have assistance for the poorest, you know, financial assistance, things like that. But that ultimately comes back to kind of politics rather than, you know, sort of climate per se. So that's all to say that there are tensions and trade-offs that are involved, and that's something that political leaders are going to have to wrestle with. But I think, at least in the short and medium term, we really do need to prioritize climate mitigation, because if we don't, the long-term effects on those other things that we care about, whether it's water or food security, are going to be much worse. So that's, I guess, the you know, the first point I would make there. I see actually maybe we have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So
can I read that to you?
Yeah, sure. If you,
This is by Decham Palmo, who thanks you for the presentation. And you mentioned in your talk that China's damming on the upper Brahmaputra will not have a significant impact on the downstream river flow. But many incidents have happened in Arunachal Pradesh and Assam, where huge changes in the river flow affects the local farmers. What do you think about the super dam that's coming up in the Great Bend? What impact will it have on the downstreams? And the other is why China has not signed a water sharing treaty with any of the downstream countries, and what can a downstream country do when China exploits the international rivers?
Yeah, so good questions, and thank you, Dechen, for attending. We've had a couple of email correspondences, I know, over the years, so it's a pleasure to be able to interact with you virtually, at least. So look, you know, I don't mean to suggest there's no impact or no negative impact from a 60 gigawatt hydro dam being built on the upper Brahmaputra. It will have a really significant effect. But I think it's important, if we're sort of thinking about this as an international security issue, I would want to, I think it's just important to contextualize this, because the concern that's often voiced from Indian audiences, and particularly in the press in India, is that these dams are going to sort of cut off the flow of water downstream into India and Bangladesh. And that's just not really true. But that being said, there are significant negative effects from building the dam. It does, even though it doesn't really kind of alter much the total volume of flow, particularly in the lower basin, what it does do is disrupt the kind of timing of those flows, and it can increase the risk of flooding, because a dam will allow you to, I mean, it'll certainly interrupt the flow of water and cause water to back up, so that if for any reason the dam operator, China, decided to release a larger than usual volume of flow through the dam, or, you know, God forbid, there's an earthquake and the dam fails and there's a huge release of water, there is a major, you know, flood risk. So it's not that there are no kind of aspects to be concerned about, but I think it's important to understand where the potential concern might come from, because it's often thought of as this contributor to Sino-Indian tension, whereas I would argue that the dams and the water themselves don't really constitute much of a security threat. What we're seeing is just the impact of broader geopolitical tensions between China and India being sort of projected into water issues. And I might make one other point about that. I think to the extent that water resources kind of figure into Sino-Indian tension, it really has much more to do about territorial disputes in the Himalaya than it does water disputes themselves. The water disputes kind of just become focal points for the territorial disputes. They sort of proxy for the territory. I will make one other point about this, though. I think it's important not to lose sight of. The construction of these large dams and the associated infrastructure will probably have a very negative effect on local communities and cultures. And one sort of disturbing thing that I've come across a couple of times in my research on large dam projects and the South-North water transfer, which we didn't talk about, we can if anybody's interested. It's one of China's major water kind of projects, is the idea that part of the reason for building these big infrastructure projects in Tibet or Xinjiang or other minority-dominated regions is in part kind of to more closely tie those regions to the central government and to sort of the People's Republic. And so I think there is a degree to which these infrastructure projects kind of contribute to a sense of or a strategy of kind of control or subordination of local communities and cultures into the broader nation. So I think there is a sort of disturbing and disconcerting kind of human rights aspect of those infrastructure projects.
Right, so thank you. There is one question by Nagarajan Krishnamurthy. Will there be any low-cost technology in solar power usage and in converting the seawater into potable water? Is there any scope of it? Would any of our panelists want to speak, or Professor Moore? Any response, Professor Moore?
Sure, I'd be happy to just offer a couple of thoughts on both parts of that question. So solar power is fascinating because the cost of solar has decreased by more than any other energy source in history. And in fact, the degree of kind of scale that we've seen in solar has been, as far as anybody can tell, basically unprecedented in the entire history of technology. I mean, it's really astonishing. And yet, we still have two big problems. One, solar is still, too small a portion of the global energy supply to really make a dent in our sort of climate change problem. So even though it's happening about as fast as anything ever has in history, it's still not happening fast enough. And at the same time, solar hasn't really been able to substitute for what's known as baseload power generation. You can kind of think of this as like insurance for keeping the lights on, the power that just sort of makes sure that the lights stay on, regardless of the fact of whether it's a cloudy day, there's a storm brewing, there's dust on the solar panels, whatever. And so those remain kind of significant challenges to solar. There's a lot of technological development. I think we need probably at least one, maybe two more generations of solar technology development before it really gets to a point at which it can be the world's dominant energy source. We also need major progress on energy storage, whether it's batteries or some other form of storing the power that's generated by solar for usage later on. Then the second part of your question around desalination is a really important one, because so I think that the water problem globally is mostly about agriculture, and there's really no technology on the horizon that would make desalination a practical solution to agricultural water demand, under all but the most kind of unusual niche circumstances. Desalinated water is used for irrigation in Israel in limited quantities, for example, but that's a very special case, and we can't expect that to really ever be true on a large scale globally. However, it is conceivable that desalination could essentially become the backup water source for most major cities, especially those on the coasts. We're still a little ways from that. There are some promising developments in renewable kind of powered desalination. That still will not be practical without, again, sort of significant technological developments in most cases. The one thing that I think would today be very feasible in terms of desalination is nuclear powered desalination. But nuclear, has a lot of safety kind of hazards associated with it at the moment. It certainly is tremendously expensive. So, for a country like India, that would remain a fairly significant barrier, just the sheer cost involved in nuclear power development that could also be used for desalination. One final point on that, though, which is interesting. So China has been sort of leading nuclear deployment worldwide. They have about 26 plants, I believe, that are in various stages of either kind of pre-commissioning or under design or construction. And recently, the government announced a significant investment in a new type of nuclear reactor using thorium as the fuel instead of uranium, which is how all commercial nuclear plants presently that they run on uranium. And that thorium fuel cycle would have a lot of advantages, potentially in terms of cost and certainly in terms of safety. So if that technology can be commercialized, that could be as important as solar in terms of helping us reduce our emissions, as well as helping provide an effectively unlimited source of water, at least for urban water uses.
Simi, I have
Yes,
one
ma'am.
question.
Yes,
I have one
yes.
question for
Go ahead, please.
Professor.
Yes,
You
thank
mentioned
you.
about the fascinating progress in solar panels and solar energy. I've heard a couple of people saying about the environment footprint of solar panels. I wanted to ask him, is that really an issue? Because I really don't have any information on that. So like you're saying that solar panels also has a pretty big environment footprint. So I just wanted to understand from the professor.
Well, nothing's perfect. One of the I forget who first kind of introduced me to this phrase, but I use it all the time, is that essentially all forms of energy involve a bit of a Faustian bargain, a sort of deal with the devil, if you will. There's, kind of no clean, kind of really sustainable source of, of energy. Renewables are certain, wind and solar are certainly as close as it gets. That's not to say that they have no negative impacts. With wind turbines, for example, you can have very significant impacts on bird life, for example, very significant mortality of birds associated with wind turbines. But I think on balance, you would have to say that the emissions that we can avoid using large-scale solar far outweigh any negative environmental impacts. And a lot of those impacts have to do with the supply chain, particularly involved in the mining of materials used in solar power manufacture. That the mining process itself can be pretty nasty from an environmental point of view. But those impacts are, not to minimize them, but they are quite localized. Whereas again, large-scale solar, at least in principle, helps us avert catastrophic global climate change. So I would say on balance, there's really no comparison, but that's not to say that that there's not some negative impacts associated with solar or wind or other alternative energy sources. One other quick thing that this brings up, it's significant, I think, as we kind of head into the Glasgow negotiations. And this is particularly the case with China, but we're starting to see some human rights considerations color these things. So China is by far and away the leading source of a key material in solar panel manufacturer known as polysilicon. Most of that polysilicon comes from Xinjiang, which really from most authoritative sources is the site of some pretty egregious human rights violations, including forced labor. So I think that is kind of harder to get past in the sense that we may be kind of indirectly the massive expansion of solar power may be contributing to some pretty egregious human rights abuses and violations, and that's sort of a harder issue, I think, get passed.
Well, thank you. At least I have an informed response now, so that helps. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much for taking our questions very generously, Professor. Dr. Ranjana, would you like to add anything before we move to the concluding round?
Yes, in fact, I thank you. Very happy to, you were speaking in terms of the joint financing for transforming, many technologies and the use that we would like to do. And the other bit that he mentioned about the climate smart agriculture, I think that is the way forward to go. And we'll definitely have to look at water demand. So very happy to hear that he touched on those topics as well, We have to go for recycling and more recycling to reduce our water footprint. So thank you very much. That's all that I wanted to add.
Thank you very much, ma'am. So I'll just quickly to come to the concluding round, and I would request all the panelists, starting with Dr. Ranjana, to just share your perspectives on the way forward towards climate action for water security. Any 2 bullet pointers that you have, policy recommendations, suggestions, where are we moving, how we should move towards this scenario where water security can be ensured in our subcontinent. And particularly to Professor Moore, John Kerry was here a few days back. He was touring around, and a lot of media reports said that he was not really happy with India's commitments, and also in China that he was not able to meet the leaders. So what is it about the politics that is going on? Because ultimately, as you've alluded to COP26 again and again, are we going to see another debacle, or where is the light in sight? So if you could talk about that. So I would start with Dr. Ranjana. Over to you, ma'am.
Yes. So regarding the water security, I would, like to divide it in 2 parts. One would be the urban region of India, which has these mega cities where a population of more than 15 million and these regular flooding episodes. So regarding the water security, we have to do something about our flood management. And what I feel about flood management is we have to have these open green spaces and the blue spaces. We know that our lakes in the urban areas are drying up. Can we go about cleaning these lakes and diverting the flood waters that side? That is something which we really need to look at. So at the policy level, we will have to look at our blue-green infrastructure that we talk about. And in the rural sector, yes, our agriculture, the amount of water that we are using and what we are growing. Can we have sustainable crops for water security, so that we are secure, both food as well as water. So those would be my 2 pointers. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, Indira ma'am, over to you.
The way forward, I was looking, so I had so many questions for Professor Moore.
So please, you could share them and then you could
I had asked them when you gave me an opportunity earlier.
Sure.
I think we need to become more water aware and more water literate. I think that's because he rightly said that we can't always look at it being somebody else's job. One aspect of it is that we have to ourselves see how we reduce our water footprint. And he gave some examples of how to do that. Regarding the eating meat, you also raised this issue, Simi, and I also felt it's also about, not only about choice, it's also about the culture, the culture and the heritage of communities. So I was a band also with that malnutrition. I felt that it was a bit, the challenges we have. But I think, yes, other than that, the bottled water and the other things suggested and reducing and recycling, I think that's the way we need to go. I think I would again reinforce that 2 things. One is we need to engage more with all stakeholders. We can't, not only one civil society talking to another. It's also talking to government, talking to industry, talking to what he mentioned, that bring all the stakeholders together on one platform, be it within one country or across boundaries. Because in the meetings, I hear Bangladesh cursing us, I hear Nepal cursing us, then I hear India saying, oh, we're getting stuff from Nepal, So it's like, okay, let's get out of this and see how we can manage water better for all of us. And I think we should take a cue from the wisdom that we have. How we could manage our water, how we grew crops. We would grow crops that suited the location where we were. They were also nutritious. I mean, the coarse cereals, the coarse grains, what we call now, and which is becoming popular. So those kind of things also, and which don't have such a big water and energy footprint. And I think if we go local, look at local water security, local water management, then we will also control what Professor Morris said, that transporting water has a very high energy footprint. So we could also help reduce that. So yes, these are some of the thoughts.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. Wonderful. Professor Moore, over to you.
Okay, well, I think I would first underscore that one of the most effective kind of water management policies we could have globally is an effective climate policy, and especially rapid and deep cuts in our global greenhouse gas emissions. Another sort of way of saying that, I think, is that from a human perspective, I think most of the really negative impacts of climate change that we're concerned about have in one way or another to do with the changing distribution and availability of water, whether that's in terms of increased shortage or uncertainty as to volumes and flows of water throughout the year, or whether it's having too much in the form of flooding, in the form of sea level rise, saline intrusion into groundwater aquifers, et cetera. But I think as a sort of just, almost like a hashtag, I think from a human point of view, many of the most concerning effects of climate change really have to do with water. So I do think we have to think of these things as linked and as coupled. To get to Dr. Mehta's question briefly in terms of the politics and I think how to sort of shake things loose, I think unfortunately what we're talking about in terms of decarbonizing at the rate and at the scale that we need to avert a true climate catastrophe, that really means fundamentally transforming our economies, which almost without exception are really built on fossil fuels. And I think the reason that the politics were so difficult is that the scale of that transformation is just so great. And at the moment, there are still a few major missing pieces of the puzzle of how we can transform our economies and truly decarbonize. We have a lot of the right technologies, especially solar power. But again, there are key kind of missing pieces like battery storage. Or like smart grids that it will kind of allow us to make the most of renewable energy. So we need more investment in technology, research and development in order to make this transition and make it sort of practical and economical to kind of achieve this transformation, this decarbonization. That being said too, and getting back to kind of thinking about water, I remain pretty optimistic that we can avert a true catastrophe with enough investment in technology. Another, by the way, Dr. Mehta brought up sugarcane and sort of things like this. In addition to clean technology research, which is essentially about materials, especially nanomaterials, another key area of technology development that I think is really important is synthetic biology and gene editing. Which does show a lot of promise to help make crops more drought resistant. I mean, it already has made crops significantly more drought resistant, but also potentially to reduce water use. And there are even things that are maybe a little bit further out in terms of the horizon, but may be practical, like making bacteria found in the soil more efficient at fixing carbon, so that they could actually help sequester carbon from the atmosphere much more quickly, for example. So I think biotech and material science are the key kind of areas for more technology research and development. And I think if we're able to do that effectively, that will help to make the politics easier as climate mitigation and emissions reduction becomes cheaper and easier.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful discussion today, and so many questions, so many points, perspectives. I think we can have yet another discussion on the same topic with all of you, and we'd still be, seeking answers to so many points. So thank you so much. And I would like to now propose the vote of thanks on behalf of the IMPRI Center for Climate Change, for Environment, Climate Change and Sustainable Development. This excellent discussion led by Professor Scott Moore. Thank you, sir, for joining us early in the morning. And to our distinguished panelists, Professor Dr. Indira Khurana and Dr. Ranjana Ray Chaudhuri, to all those who were watching us here on Zoom and also on Facebook Live, and who would also watch us later on YouTube and listen to our podcasts. So thank you so much. And we hope that we continue to keep learning from you. This is very important, and this is really going to be pertinent for times to come. So thank you. And I wish you all, on behalf of IMPRI, a very, very good day. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, ma'am.
Thank you so much. A pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.